Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Minecraft Disney. Here we are outside of Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin. Now typically the way this series works is I'll explore the ride and talk a little bit about its history. However, we're going to do things a little differently this time. What's so great about Walt Disney World is that they're always changing, they're always improving, they're always trying to put new things into the parks to entertain guests and keep people happy, and part of that means closing old attractions. I love a lot of the old attractions. Having grown up going to Disney World, I have a lot of fond memories of some of the older attractions. Now, because MC Magic's goal here is to recreate one-to-one scale Walt Disney World as it is now, there aren't a lot of old attractions built. However, I didn't want to let that stop me from talking about the history of some of the older attractions that aren't here any longer. So while today we're here outside Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin, we're not going to be talking about it. We're actually going to be talking about the two attractions that preceded it, which were If You Had Wings and Delta's Dreamflight. So let's walk around a little bit and talk about it. So, like I said, there were two attractions here in Tomorrowland that lived in the same space that Buzz Lightyear did. The first one was called If You Had Wings, and then the second one was called Delta's Dreamflight. But there were actually a lot of names. There were a lot of names attached to it, and there's a pretty complicated history to it. So, what If You Had Wings was, it was an attraction that opened in the summer of 1972. It was a ride that was almost unforgivingly a promotional vehicle for Eastern Airlines, who were the people who sponsored the ride. In fact, the initial sponsorship was about $10 million. And what it was essentially a long commercial for Eastern Airlines. You would get in a Omnimover ride system, and you would be taken through all of these dioramas of all these different places that Eastern Airlines flew, showing you these great, beautiful travel vacations, with the idea that, I guess, by the end of it, you would want to fly with Eastern Airlines to go to these different places. It was a ride that was designed by Claude Coates, and the song, which I guess depending on how you feel about it is famous or infamous, was written by Buddy Baker. It's kind of one of those songs, in my opinion, where if you didn't grow up with it, without that nostalgia, you kind of see it for how almost cultish it is. It's very repetitive. But it would play in the back of this 4.5-minute ride, and you would go through these different scenes, and what it would do is it would do rear projection of these different locations onto a screen. They used 16mm projectors for the most part. In all, they ended up using 38 of these projectors. Now, here's the thing. If you've never been around a film projectors are kind of loud. So the song was meant to try and cover up the sound of these projectors running, but unfortunately it didn't really work. You still could kind of hear the projectors. It just was one of those rides that, I think people have a fond memory for it for this reason alone, or maybe mainly for this reason, which is to say that Disney World, when it first opened, was not free for every ride. Like, the way it works now at Disney is you go and you buy a ticket and you go into the theme park, and then you can ride whatever you want as many times as you want. You just have free reign. But that's not how it always was. When Disney World first opened, you would go and you would pay to get in, and then you would buy a ticket book, and you'd have different classes of tickets, and you would use those tickets to ride on rides, similar to the way, I guess, carnivals used to be in the past. And so, that's sort of where the terminology of an e-ticket attraction comes from. E-tickets were the biggest and the most expensive tickets for the biggest rides. So when they always talk about, how Expedition Everest is an e-ticket attraction, what that just basically means is it's going to be a big major attraction. However, If You Had Wings was one of, if not the only at the time, free attraction at the Magic Kingdom. So you could go on it as many times as you wanted. And I think that's sort of why you saw Disney, be okay with the fact that it was very unapologetically a promotional ride. A lot of these attractions were sponsored by companies, but they weren't too heavily, forcing it on the person while they were on the ride. For instance, the Carousel of Progress was sponsored by GE, so they would just use GE appliances in the scenes, but they didn't sing a GE song. They weren't talking about GE. Here, this was more or less meant to just be an Eastern Airlines commercial. So much so that when you actually got off of the ride in the post-show area, there would be a reservation desk where you can go and make reservations with Eastern Airlines to any of the locations that you saw throughout the ride. I tried to find statistics to see how many people actually did this, but I'm pretty sure not a lot of people ended up doing it. So this went on for quite a bit of time. It ended up, Eastern Airlines withdrew their sponsorship in 1987, and the attraction closed on June of that year. The company itself, Eastern Airlines, just went out of business just a couple of years after that, so they weren't doing very well. And what Disney ended up doing was from 1987 to 1989, they just rebranded it to If You Could Fly. So they took out all the Eastern Airlines branding, changed the song, but kept the ride more or less the same. Then in 1989, it closed down. And in June of 1989, it opened as Delta's Dreamflight. Delta took over the sponsorship. They retooled the whole ride, but it was very similar. It was the idea that this ride was meant to be a big old advertisement for flying with Delta. And in a very similar way, it was basically you sitting in this Omnimover ride system, going through these different scenes that show people flying, you flying, places you could fly to. The idea was essentially to just get you excited about flying to these different locations. That went on for some time too. What happened though is very similar to If You Had Wings. In 1996, Delta Dreamflight was renamed to just Dreamflight as Delta pulled their sponsorship. I think at that point you were seeing a fundamental shift in the way that, you know, sponsorships and marketing occurred. You know, 1996, the internet was really just starting to blow up and become a popular thing, you know, across the United States. And I think a lot of companies started to realize that, you know, paying millions of dollars to sponsor these attractions wasn't as effective as, you know, paying to advertise on the internet. So it became Dreamflight, and Disney, again, like they did with If You Had Wings, they sort of took out all of the Delta mentions, redid the song, tried to turn it into sort of like a generic flying ride. But that didn't last very long. In fact, it was Dreamflight for just less than a year. From January of 1996 to June of 1996, it was Dreamflight. And then from June of 1996 to January of 1998, it was Take Flight. So again, they changed the song up. They, retooled it a little bit, but it was more or less the same experience. And then from 96 to January of 1998, it was Take Flight, and then it closed down. And then in October of 1998, it became Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin, which is the ride we know today. Partially, the reason that Delta also dropped their sponsorship was due to the fact that they paid a lot of money to sponsor the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. So, you know, they only had so much money in their sponsorship budget, and it had to go somewhere. So it ended up going towards the Olympics. But as you could see, you know, you saw this shift in Disney World in general, where you saw less and less companies sponsoring attractions, and you see Disney sort of taking over some of them more, just because of that fundamental shift in the way companies sort of operate with their sponsorships. One cool thing about Delta Dreamflight, though, is that in one scene, you sort of have this all-encompassing screen around you, sort of like a 360 degrees, but not exactly. It was more like, cylindrical. And it actually has clips of, like, CG clips of people flying above the earth and then flying in, like, a canyon and then in this futuristic sci-fi city with all these fireworks going off. And that was actually the first theatrical format computer animation ever produced, by which I mean it wasn't the first computer animation ever produced, but it was one produced to be displayed on a 70 millimeter projector. So despite being just sort of like a blatant advertisement for a company, it actually did push some boundaries in terms of technology, which just goes to show you that Disney, you know, they don't slack off. No matter what attraction it is, whether it's an e-ticket, Expedition Everest, or it's, you know, this free Delta's Dreamflight, If You Had Wings combination, they're going to put as much effort as they can into it. But yeah, that's sort of just like a quick look at the history of, you know, what was here before it became Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin. Again, I grew up with the Delta Dreamflight era. I have fond memories of that ride, as cheesy as it was, as sort of earwormish the song was meant to be. You know, I kind of remember it fondly. I have no memories of If You Had Wings, just because I wasn't alive when that ride was open. But it just goes to show you that, you know, for every ride that's here at Disney, there is a rich history behind it. And I'm hopefully going to be doing more of these where I go to the current rides and just talk a little bit about what was there beforehand, so you could get a little quick look at, the version of Disney World that you might not have ever known before. Or if you did know it before, it's, a nice quick look back at, a version of the parks that are no longer exist. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching. I would love to hear what attractions you think I should revisit. Not revisit, sorry, that's a whole other series. But what attractions would you like to me explore the history of, rides before it? There's so much, especially here, you've got the Timekeeper, we've got Horizons, you've got Body Wars. There's just so much rich Disney history that's no longer there, and I'd love to continue exploring it. Anyway, whatever you're doing this week, make the most of it because it makes it so much better. I hope to see you all here next week for the next episode of Minecraft Disney. Bye, everybody.